Andrea Smith-Ngoization of the Palestine Liberation Movement interviews with Haytham Bazian, Noura Erakat, Ataf said, and Zaina Zaatari around the globe. Nonprofits and non-governmental organizations have worked closely with the U.S. government to influence and direct the shape of liberation movements. As can be seen by the Ford Foundation's defunding of Insight, Women of Color Against Violence, and other organizations over the issue of Palestine, it is clear that NGOs are very much involved in efforts by the U.S. government to steer the course of the Palestine liberation movement. The impact of NGOization on this movement is analyzed through interviews with the following longtime activists in the struggle. Haytham Bazian has been involved in the Palestinian struggle for over 20 years through such groups as the Free Palestine Association, the Islamic Association for Palestine, the Union of Palestinian Association, the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, American Muslims for Jerusalem, American Muslims for Palestine Solidarity Committee, Students for Justice in Palestine, and Al-Ada. He currently lives in Northern California. Noura Erakat is a New Voices Fellow working on grassroots activism and a legal project using American laws to give Palestinians recourse against Israeli military officials. She is a steering committee member of Arab Movement of Women Arising for Justice and a founding member of the Divestment Support Committee, which seeks to support students, communities, and institutions in their efforts to divest from Israel. A recent graduate of the University of California, Berkeley School of Law, Erakat is also a cultural worker writing, performing, and producing pieces meant to transcend the otherwise formidable structures we battle daily. Ataf has been involved in human rights organizations, including NGOs, since 1995. He has worked with the Center for Human Rights Legal Aid and the Arab Center for Independence of the Judiciary and the Legal Profession. He worked as a research assistant and research director. His field of research includes labor rights and political prisoners' rights and torture. Said worked at the Hisham Mubarak Law Center, and he volunteered at the Socialist Research Center. Zaina Zaatari is the program officer for the Middle East and North Africa at the Global Fund for Women. She is also involved in the National Council of Arab Americans, Sunbila, Arab Feminists for Change, and the Free Palestine Alliance, a brief history of the Palestine liberation movement. Palestinians are among the indigenous inhabitants of historic Palestine Mandate, a land stretching from the Mediterranean coast east across the Jordan River and from the Gulf of Aqaba north beyond the Sea of Galilee. Today, this geographical area is divided between the State of Israel and the West Bank and Gaza Strip, which Israel occupied in 1967. Palestinian cities, villages, and most of the 19 official refugee camps in the latter areas were transferred to a self-governing Palestinian Authority in the 1990s under the Madrid-Oslo peace process. The bulk of this land area, however, remains under full Israeli military control. Over the course of the 20th century, the Palestinian people have experienced several periods of major displacement, beginning during the First Arab-Zionist-Israeli War in 1947-48, followed by a second major displacement in the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, and again, as recently as 1991, when some 350,000 Palestinians were displaced from Kuwait during the Gulf War. Additional displacement has resulted from Israeli government policies and practices in Israel and in the 1967 occupied Palestinian territories, including land confiscation, house demolition, revocation of residency status, and deportation, as well as from government policies and armed conflict in various countries of asylum in the region. Palestinian refugees from the 1948 displacement and their descendants make up the bulk of the Palestinian refugee population today, numbering over 5 million persons and constituting nearly two-thirds of the Palestinian people. If one includes Palestinians displaced for the first time in the 1967 war and internally displaced Palestinians inside Israel, approximately three-quarters of the Palestinian people have been uprooted from their traditional lands over the past 5 decades, making them the largest and one of the longest-standing unresolved refugee groups in the world today. The majority of these refugees reside within 100 miles of their places of origin inside Israel, in the occupied West Bank and the Gaza Strip, but are unable to exercise their right of return to their homes and lands of origin. The State of Israel opposes the return of Palestinian refugees based on its desire to maintain Israel as a Jewish state, characterized by a solid demographic Jewish majority and Jewish control of the land. The right of the Palestinian people to self-determination was first recognized by the League of Nations in 1919. Palestine, which had been part of the Ottoman Empire until its collapse at the end of World War I, was among a number of non-self-governing Arab territories in the Middle East that were placed under temporary tutelage or administration of foreign powers under the League of Nations mandate system until the peoples of these territories were deemed ready for independence. In 1922, the League of Nations entrusted the mandate for Palestine to Great Britain. Contrary to the intent and purpose of the mandate system, Great Britain also recognized the demand of the Zionist movement to establish an exclusive Jewish state in Palestine. Under the terms of the 1922 Mandate for Palestine, as drafted by the British government, the British administration in Palestine was required to secure the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine through Jewish immigration and settlement. As for the majority of the inhabitants of the country, who were referred to as the non-Jewish communities, the 1922 Mandate only recognized their civil and religious rights. Their political rights, including the right to self-determination, were ignored. In early 1947, the British government informed the United Nations of its intention to withdraw from Palestine, ending more than 2 decades of mandatory rule. Despite the fact that the League of Nations had recognized the provisional independence of Palestine, the UN General Assembly decided to establish a special committee of inquiry to formulate recommendations for the future status of Palestine. Repeated requests by key Arab states, including former mandated territories, to obtain an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice concerning the legal obligation of the UN to recognize the independence of Palestine under the terms of the League of Nations mandate system were rejected by the General Assembly. In November 1947, the General Assembly adopted a plan based on recommendations of the majority of the members of the Special Committee of Inquiry for the division of Palestine into 2 states, one Arab and one Jewish. The recommendation was adopted despite the wishes of the majority of the inhabitants. Irrespective of unresolved legal issues and provisions in the plan for the protection of minority rights in each state, opponents of Resolution 181 argued that its terms were inequitable. The proposed Jewish state was allotted 56% of the territory of historic Palestine, even though Jewish inhabitants of Palestine constituted less than 1/3 of the population and owned not more than 7% of the land. The collapse of the UN-sponsored initiative, after 168, the revolution will not be funded. Key supporters backed away from implementing it by force, and the subsequent war in 1948 led to the depopulation of some 530 villages and the displacement expulsion of some 750,000 Palestinians. Some 20 years later, the United Nations Security Council adopted Resolution 242, calling upon Israel to withdraw from the territories it occupied in the 1967 Israeli-Arab War, including Eastern Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. Several 100,000 Palestinians, including refugees from 1948, were displaced during the 1967 war and have been denied the right to return to their homes and lands in these territories due to Israel's continued military occupation. The mass exodus and displacement of Palestinians is also related to gross and persistent human rights violations. During the 1948 war, the Palestinian Arab population was displaced and expelled in large numbers, first by Zionist militias and later by Israeli forces after the unilateral establishment of the State of Israel in May 1948, through a combination of tactics that violated basic principles of international law. These tactics included indiscriminate military attacks on civilians, massacres, looting, destruction of property, and forced expulsion. Israeli military forces later instituted shoot-to-kill policies at the front lines to prevent infiltration. After the signing of armistice agreements in 1949 between Israel and its Arab neighbors, Israel subsequently adopted a series of laws concerning citizenship and nationality which effectively prevented Palestinian refugees from returning to their homeland, as well as a series of abandoned property, laws to dispossess refugees of their property and transfer it to full Jewish control. Many of these same violations of international law were committed against Palestinians during the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, leading again to mass displacement and imposed exile. Palestinian residents of villages near the ceasefire lines, including, for example, the villages of Imwas, Yalu, and Beit Nuba in the Latron area and the Moroccan quarter of the Old City of Jerusalem, were expelled from their homes, which were completely demolished by Israeli military forces. Palestinian civilians who were fleeing areas of conflict were strafed by Israeli aircraft, while others were transferred out of the West Bank on Israeli buses. In some cases, young Palestinian men were forced to sign documents that they were leaving voluntarily. As in 1948, Israeli forces shot at Palestinian civilians, including women and children, attempting to cross the border and return to their homes and lands. Illustrate the impact of these policies. It is estimated that over 3 decades of Israeli policies of land confiscation, house demolition, revocation of residency rights, and deportation have led to the forced displacement of several thousand Palestinians. The 1970 conflict between the government of Jordan and the Palestine Liberation Organization, the Civil War and Israeli invasion of Lebanon in the 1980s, the 1991 Gulf War, and the violation of basic human rights of Palestinian refugees residing in these areas, including the massacre of several thousand Palestinian refugees in the camps of Sabra and Shatila in Beirut by Lebanese Christian phalangists allied with Israel, has led to further displacement, with many Palestinians having experienced multiple displacements in their lifetime. On December 11, 1948, the United Nations General Assembly set forth the basic framework for addressing Palestinian refugees in Resolution 194. Based on principles of international law, Resolution 194 affirms the right of each Palestinian refugee to choose to return to his or her home and receive compensation for damages. Palestinian refugees choosing not to return are to be compensated for their losses and damages and are entitled to resettlement. The United Nations established a special regime to facilitate the implementation of durable solutions, the UN Conciliation Commission for Palestine, and the UN Relief and Works Agency. The UNCCP was established in 1948 under Resolution 194 to facilitate the return and compensation or resettlement and compensation of Palestinian refugees based on their individual choices. 1 year later, the UN established the UNRWA to facilitate relief and a works program for Palestinian refugees until they were able to exercise their right to return to their homes. These two bodies, the UNCCP and UNRWA, were respectively to provide protection and assistance to Palestinian refugees. All other refugees receive protection and assistance from the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, which was established in 1950. However, if for any reason protection or assistance for Palestinian refugees ceases to exist vis-a-vis the UNHCR, the 1951 Refugee Convention stipulates under Article ID that the protection or assistance gap should be filled by the UNHCR within the framework of relevant UN resolutions, namely Resolution 194. In other words, UNHCR would be obligated to facilitate the return of Palestinian refugees who choose to do so, and would not be free to facilitate resettlement elsewhere, except for refugees who have made a free and informed choice not to exercise the right to return to their homes. Several years after it was established, the UNCCP ceased to provide protection to Palestinian refugees, due in large part to Israel's opposition to the return of refugees, and the lack of international will to uphold basic principles of international law applicable to Palestinian refugees. The UNCCP, however, did complete an identification and assessment of refugee properties, which is archived at UN headquarters in New York. While UNRWA assistance provides a significant degree of protection of the daily economic and social rights of Palestinian refugees, the collapse of the UNCCP has left Palestinian refugees without legal and diplomatic protection, physical protection, and protection related to durable solutions. Under the Oslo-Madrid process, which began in the early 1990s, the Palestinian refugee issue, among a set of other issues such as Jerusalem, settlements, borders, and water, was left for so-called final status negotiations as set forth in the 1993 Declaration of Principles signed by Israel and the PLO. The agreement does not make explicit reference to Resolution 194, the guiding framework for durable solutions for Palestinian refugees, nor does it make explicit reference to international law as the foundation for a comprehensive agreement. In fact, during final status talks in July and December 2000, Israel's position and U.S. bridging proposals on the refugee issue attempted to secure a political agreement whereby Israel would recognize the right of return. In principle, Palestinians, in turn, would agree to forego the right of return in practice in order to maintain the Jewish demographic majority in Israel and Jewish control of refugee properties. Palestinian refugees and the Palestinian political leadership have rejected this formula as a basis for a resolution of the refugee issue. Palestinians argue, rather, that for a solution to be durable, it must be based on international law and practice as applied in other refugee cases, such as in Kosovo, Bosnia, Guatemala, and Mozambique. This includes the individual right of refugees to return to their homes, restitution of properties, and compensation. Between September 16 and 18, 1982, several thousand Palestinian refugees, men, women, and children were brutally slaughtered by Lebanese Christian Phalangist forces allied with Israel, while Israeli forces looked on and prevented refugees from fleeing the camps. The massacre happened within weeks of the U.S.-brokered withdrawal of PLO fighters from Lebanon in the late summer of 1982. Left without protection, Israeli allied Lebanese forces were able to enter the camps of West Beirut without opposition. On September 16, the day the massacre began, General Amos Yaron, commander of Israeli forces in Lebanon and later Director General of the Israeli Defense Ministry, provided Lebanese forces intelligence with aerial photographs to facilitate entry into the camps. When Israel finally ordered the withdrawal of the Lebanese forces 2 days later, the camps had been destroyed and several thousand refugees had either been slaughtered or had disappeared. Today, one of the mass graves is used for dumping garbage, and another has been paved over for a golf course. An Israeli commission subsequently found then Defense Minister Ariel Sharon indirectly responsible for the massacre. This poem by Noura Erakat speaks to the lived realities of colonization and occupation in Palestine that ground the current liberation struggle. 3 home demolitions and 1 pending order for the Alatrash family in Hebron occupied Palestine the first time the bulldozers came. I was at school challenged with negative numbers who thought 0 had an inferior. I ate a hard-boiled egg for breakfast and drank mint tea sugared by Mama's sweet fingers and break. Lena and I clapped our hands and sang, "Sister, sister, where is Mama? Mama's in the city. What's she doing? Kneading dough. Where is Baba?" The second time they came, I stood in the doorway. Israeli bulldozers needed to crush me if they wanted to trample my home again, but the soldiers didn't care that I was 15 and female long hair, just made it easier to pull me away. They spit on Mama, but she wouldn't move. Not her baby's home, she screamed. She looked so strong. I swear I thought her fingers would shoot lightning. It took 3 soldiers to take her down, expose her breasts to the watchful sky, spill her hair from her God-fearing hijab, and push her into the wailing dirt. 172. The revolution will not be funded. Baba choked on his own screams. I think breathing got too hard for him because he stopped crying, and the Israeli soldier clenched his curly head to keep him watching the stones of his 15-hour work days, selling hot sesame seed bread crumble. After a while, Baba couldn't taste his bloody mouth, couldn't see his littered teeth through his purple swollen eyes. I bet he even forgot about the rifle's eyes glaring into his neck. My brother Hassan jumped without thinking, ran for his books. It was his final year. 3 more weeks. He would take his matriculation exams and graduate to university. He was going to be an engineer, going to build bridges to connect Palestine's torn back, but one Israeli soldier kicked his hands with a sharp black boot so hard his books flew into suffocating mud, sealed their pages silent. Those aren't cheap cost, Baba. 40 hours work just to buy 2 books. The mud ate 6, and Hassan watched his bridge collapse now. He drives a taxi 17 hours in our 24-hour days. The third time they came, I lay in my husband's bed staring at the ceiling. Mama, Baba, and Hassan did not Could not know, because the bulldozers always came back before we could finish rebuilding our home. I lay in my husband's bed awake. I couldn't stop sleeping with marriage, because I knew the NGOization of the Palestine Liberation Movement. 173 Mama, Baba and Hassan couldn't fall asleep in half-built homes without roofs, but Mama and Baba wanted one of their babies to know the inside of an undemolished home the next time they come. I'll be strapped with a ticking vest, missiles loaded on my shoulders, and landmines beneath my feet, a slingshot on my ears and rocks on my belt, daring the Israeli soldier to take one more step. How have nonprofits impacted Palestinian and other Arab liberation struggles? Hatem Bazian, NGOs control the purse strings. Through this funding, or through the staff they hire, they assert their political agenda. For example, the largest coalition of organizations that work on Palestine do not insist on U.S. divestment from Israel or devote organizing resources into achieving this agenda. But look at the solidarity movements that developed around apartheid South Africa and Central America. They made divestment central to their struggle. These movements recognize that economic sanctions and pressure are central to change a government's policies. But when it comes to Palestine, NGOs do not want to offend certain segments of the liberal Zionist community. So they shift their focus to changing Israel's mind without making Israel suffer. This kind of strategy was dismissed as ineffectual in the South African and Central American solidarity movements. The Palestinian struggle has demanded the right to return for all Palestinian refugees and calls for Palestine to be a complete whole. But today, almost all NGOs and foundations call for a two-state solution that insists Israel, as it's currently constructed, must exist as is, and that Palestinians must learn to accept colonization and occupation. The two-state solution defends Israel's right to define itself on racially exclusivist criteria and hence exist as a racially apartheid state. Further, by proposing that Palestine exist as a divided, demilitarized state whose resources are fully controlled by Israel, this approach effectively eliminates the possibility of Palestinians having a real state. 174. The revolution will not be funded that encompasses their historical and international rights. In other words, this solution would essentially dispense with the 6 million Palestinian refugees. In other solidarity movements, there is often the understanding that they exist to support liberation struggles, not to dictate the terms of those struggles. However, when it comes to Palestine, NGOs feel they have the right to tell Palestinians what to do. In their framework, the problem is not Israeli colonization and occupation. The problem is that Palestinians need to be trained to develop civil society and learn to cooperate with Israel. Consequently, funding is often focused on developing joint Israeli-Palestinian ventures and projects rather than address the issue of occupation. Furthermore, the NGOization of the solidarity movement in the U.S. has been so thorough that anyone who criticizes this position is silenced and marginalized. Without exception, every foundation that funds work on Palestine does so from the understanding that Israel, as it currently exists, should stay intact, and the solution is to change Palestinians so that they will adapt to their colonial situation. Now, for instance, that wants to bring Palestinian intellectuals to the U.S. to train them. Train them to do what? Train them to see the situation the way the U.S. does and facilitate the continued colonization of Palestine? Zaina Zatari, organizations that are able to operate and function and have enough resources to hire staff. These organizations are careful and strategic about what they say. There are lines they do not cross, or else they are penalized. United for Peace and Justice has more foundation support than Act Now to stop war and end racism, although both coalition efforts organize against war. A big difference is that Answer includes Arab organizations with a clear political view. Groups UPFJ doesn't invite into its leadership. Basically, it is not okay for organizations to address Zionism or historic Palestine. You can talk about occupation, but you cannot talk about discrimination within the Israeli state or the right to return. For instance, San Francisco Women Against Rape lost funding when it started to address the issue of Zionism in its organization. On the issue of Lebanon, it is okay to send money for support services, but it is not okay to talk about liberation. If you talk about violence, you must denounce the liberation movement in Lebanon. You cannot focus on the violence perpetrated by Israel. follow the money, and it's clear that foundations are driving these and other political agendas. For another example of how deeply foundation funding impacts this movement, compare the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee with the National Council of Arab Americans. The ADC works with the FBI, supports U.S. interventions in Afghanistan, does not take clear stands on Palestine, and works with U.S. government officials who are responsible for killing our people. Its focus is to make Arabs acceptable to the mainstream U.S., not grassroots organizing. The National Council of Arab Americans, meanwhile, calls for an end to the colonization of Palestine, addresses Zionism, and does not support the two-state solution. Consequently, it has a much more difficult time getting funding. Additionally, as a result of the Patriot Act, even individuals are afraid to support Arab liberation organizations because they are targeted by the U.S. government. Atef Salt, in Egypt, NGOization often competes with grassroots organizing work. For instance, in labor organizing, NGOs encourage workers not to clash with business owners, thus pacifying labor struggles. Sadly, most NGO leaders were previously involved in the country's left movements, but were seduced into the NGO world because they can be funded and incur less trouble with the establishment. A significant problem with this model, of course, is that NGOs depend on foundations for their resources, not the people. Thus, they spend little if any time organizing and are instead accountable only to their funders. For example, since NGOs are dependent on foundation support, directors of NGOs focus on quantity rather than quality of work. In 1997 and 1998, I started to observe from my work in these human rights NGOs that they are a bit isolated, and while they claim to defend people's human rights, they are not invested in the question of social change and social justice. For instance, if we look at the case of workers who are fired or on strike, a labor organizer would work with them to continue their activism and organization. But the NGO legal aid staffer would ask to be authorized legally to sue the employer on the worker's behalf. In other words, the NGO asks the worker to stop his activism. Go home and just authorize me to sue him. After 1998, I continued to work in these NGOs with no big hope that they will really do genuine human rights work. I started to work voluntarily with labor as well as the Palestine Solidarity Movement, and it became clear that my work for human rights NGOs was just a paid job. On the positive side, because of growing social movements that are not NGOized, particularly those in support of Palestine, some NGOs are focusing more on grassroots work. Even if it impacts their funding 0.5 historically, how has the NGOization of the Palestinian struggle developed? Hatem Baslan. Beginning in the 18th century, Christian missionary workers emerged in the Middle East and set about influencing policy through education. 176, the revolution, will not be funded banking institutions also developed that became involved with Christian elites European countries, in turn, often claimed themselves as the protectors of Christians in the area to justify political intervention in the region. Using educational exchange programs, England, France, and later, the U.S. aspired to create an elite within the region that would support their interests. After Israel was created in 1948, the Palestinian liberation movement was often shaped by Arab states. They tried to control the movement and its interaction with Israel so that it would not negatively impact their diplomatic relations with Western countries. The PLO, which was constructed from outside Palestine, mirrored the authoritarian structure and corruption of the neo-colonial Arab states. However, since the uprising of the 1980s, the shaping of this movement has shifted from outside Palestine to inside of it. It is now less susceptible to being co-opted into the Arab state structure and can assert a different vision for struggle. This vision, of course, is fluid, and the movement has diverse sectors. After the 1970s, NGOs emerged as key shapers of the movement, but they too attempted to influence the movement in ways that accorded with U.S. and Western interests. So, while NGOization is a more recent phenomenon, it is part of a legacy of outside interests attempting to shape a liberation struggle in a way that supports imperial forces rather than the Palestinian people. Zaina Zaatari. Oslo helped set the framework for what is and is not acceptable. Pre-Oslo, or during the First Intifada, political movements were still strong, organizing within Palestine, and to a lesser extent, in refugee camps outside Palestine. But Oslo isolated the Palestinian issue as unrelated to larger Arab-Israeli conflicts and transformed the movement by shifting its focus from liberation to statehood and from decolonization to peace. Funders supported the Oslo agenda by rewarding projects concerned with mutual coexistence and forced the collaboration between Israeli and Palestinian groups. Within Palestine, organizations previously concerned with a broader vision for justice such as freedom for historic Palestine, the right of return, and the land turned their attention to smaller issues such as social services and other structures necessary for statehood, representational politics, and constitutional development. Donors put much money behind this kind of work, and the work of liberation became much more compartmentalized. For instance, the issue of refugees became separated from the larger liberation struggle, its emphasis redirected in the post-Oslo political and funding climate from the right of return to humanitarian relief. In South Africa, foundations were instrumental in directing the anti-apartheid struggle away from an anti-capitalist framework. Has any similar process happened in Palestine? Haydn Bazian, yes. 80% of the infrastructure in Palestine is funded by international granting agencies. These agencies stifle critiques of capitalism and try to normalize the free market economy in the occupied territories. They train elites within Palestine to integrate into the global economy. Now, maquiladoras are being constructed in the Gaza Strip, with the elites in Palestine negotiating with Israel to develop these economic units. The result is the development of an economic elite that will become invested in the well-being of Israel. All such efforts are funded by granting agencies, which require that these economic development programs be connected to Israel structurally. Similar strategies to tie economic elites to Israel are being used in Egypt and Jordan, primarily through the development of free trade zones. In Jordan, Israel is developing joint venture companies with Jordan elites that rely on cheap labor from Jordan and Palestine. Establishing these zones in Jordan essentially ensures that Jordanians will not try to cross into Israel while encouraging Palestinians to migrate to Jordan, so they will be less inclined to press for their right to return. Egypt has also signed an economic agreement with Israel to expand markets with Israeli investment. Again, NGOs are supporting the integration of Palestine into the capitalist global economy so that it will be dependent on Israel. Zelma Zaatari, funding agencies can only exist in a capitalist structure. Tax cuts is what make these foundations able to make money. Foundations and corporations are talking about corporate responsibility. They want to provide resources to address workers' rights and will take some steps toward issues for justice. But a full-fledged discussion of capitalism and its impact on the world is not happening. Instead, NGOs are geared toward integrating people into capitalism. In Palestine, most of the population is barely working, while NGOs use their resources to create a class of people who live comfortably on donor dollars. This class of people becomes less angry and are less compelled to transform the system. What are some alternative approaches to supporting Palestinian liberation? Zaina Zaatari. In Palestine, the alternative to NGOs is political parties. However, as in the rest of the Arab world, left political parties have not been very effective in Palestine. At times, the left was able to organize mass popular movements. But, generally, it did not work sufficiently with people on the ground. Now the left has become an elite group of people removed from the majority of the population. They speak a different language and are not able to deliver. People are less likely to follow them and are turning instead to groups like Hamas that can provide them with resources, with a vision, with hope. It is important to note that while NGOs get pressure from foundations to shape their political agenda, they also resist foundations. In Palestine, many NGOs have resisted the Ford Foundation's requirement to sign on to their statement on terrorism. Some groups are refusing to take money, and Ford had funded many educational institutes in Palestine. Other groups have created their own statements and said this is what we are willing to sign, and they have done so. Equally so, operating outside the NGO system does not necessarily mean that a group will be progressive. For instance, I have seen microcredit groups in Lebanon decide to end their dependence on the foundation system and still end up operating as if they were NGOs. That is, foundations often expect economic development groups to show growth, without consideration for the larger political and social context. These microcredit groups, in order to become independent, also ended up focusing on growth. Ironically, once they became self-sufficient, theirs became indistinguishable from a foundation agenda. Although established from a social change framework, these organizations now function as mere lending organizations. Atef said, "In Egypt, the founders of the movement, in solidarity with Palestine, declared from the very beginning that they would not accept any foreign funding. Since one of the main goals for this movement is to mobilize Egyptians in solidarity with Palestine, one of the main activities is to involve and to seek donations from ordinary Egyptians. Our sentiment is that 1 Egyptian pound from a poor Egyptian for Palestine is more honorable and appreciated than $1 million or pounds from a corrupt Egyptian business or foreign funder." The Egyptian Solidarity Movement started as an intellectual or elitist movement focused on sending donations to Palestine. They refused to criticize the Egyptian government. This changed dramatically after the state began cracking down on the movement around the end of 2001. While the U.S. media portrays Mubarak as a moderate leader, social justice activists in Egypt perceive him as a reactionary whose interests are aligned with the U.S. and Israel. The movement began to criticize Mubarak's role in pressuring the Palestinians to acquiesce to U.S. and Israeli policies, recognizing the connection between mobilizing people for Palestine and mobilizing a pro-democracy movement against the Egyptian government. Also, this movement began to be more critical of the exploitative stance of many Egyptian businessmen, and their donations were rejected. They also resisted NGOization, since NGOs in Egypt receive their money from foreign sources. Foreign money then controls the agenda of the movement. The Palestinians struggle through a human rights framework. For example, the Cairo Institute for Human Rights, a regional NGO focused on the Arab world, and the Cairo-based Arab Organization for Human Rights both monitor and report on the situation in Palestine. Some NGOs organize conferences about the rights of Palestinian refugees. Others organize conferences or seminars that make comparisons between apartheid South Africa and the situation in Palestine. These NGOs and others in Egypt also coordinate with Palestinian human rights organizations, such as the Palestinian Center for Human Rights. Notably, the CIHR organized around the 2001 UN Conference on Racism in Durban, South Africa, to highlight Israel's apartheid policies directed against Palestinians. Interestingly, however, the broader movement in Egypt was reluctant to work with CIHR because it is an NGO. As a result, very few grassroots activists were able to go to Durban due to lack of funds, as is often the case with international gatherings such as UN conventions or World Social Forums. Only people affiliated with NGOs could attend. And in Egypt, few grassroots activists have ties to NGOs. Without NGO funding, the Palestinian Solidarity Movement has funded itself with donations from ordinary people. Young children gave their pocket money. Poor women in Egyptian villages gave food from their homes. While this form of organizing may be the hard way, many activists think this approach is better than seeking meetings with government elites in five-star hotels. Despite this agreement, however, it is important to note that there are different factions within the movement. Broadly speaking, nationalists, communists, and liberals. The liberals focus on charity work and do not want to criticize Egypt's role in supporting the U.S. and Israel's suppression of the Palestinian Intifada. The nationalists focus their criticism primarily on Israel. Leftists and communists situate their work and analysis on imperialism and the role of Israel in supporting imperialist wars and occupation in the Middle East. The latter group is most invested in mobilizing mass numbers of peoples. Generally speaking, the NGOs did not want open meetings and did not have democratic leadership. Some of the more elitist leaders in the movement also opposed public open meetings, insisting that it enable the Egyptian police to infiltrate the meetings. Movement members have countered that the best way to protect the movement was to have open democratic meetings. The more democratic the leadership is, the easier it is to tell who the police agents are. And because the movement membership was so strong, they have always been able to prevent elite leadership from shutting down public meetings. $180. The revolution will not be funded. The NGOs also focus on working with government and economic elites. For instance, an elite representative of the Egyptian Committee for the Solidarity with the Palestinian Intifada said, "One successful press conference is more important than 10 demonstrations." However, this approach is a minority opinion. Generally speaking, the movement does not support NGOization. Notes 1 from Bay Area Insight. Chapter 2. Apart from a very small number of family reunification cases, Israel continues to refuse to allow any refugees to return to their homes. 3. The UN has repeatedly affirmed the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people in these territories. General Assembly Resolution 3236, adopted in 1974, for example, reaffirmed the inalienable right of the Palestinian people to self-determination and the inalienable right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and lands from which they were uprooted. 4. Researcher Rosemary Saya describes the scene as the massacre unfolded. The targeted area was crammed with people recently returned from the places where they had taken refuge during the war, now supposedly over. Schools would soon open. Everyone needed to repair their homes, clear the streets, and get ready for the winter. There was fear of what the regime of Bashir Gemayel would bring, but there was also determination to rebuild. People felt some security from the fact that they were unarmed, and that all who remained were legal residents. Many of the massacre victims were found clutching their identity cards, as if trying to prove their legitimacy. One contingent of the special units commanded by Hobika entered the area through the sandhills overlooking Heorson, just opposite the IDF headquarters. At this stage, they were almost certainly accompanied by Israeli soldiers, since the dunes had been fortified by the resistance. Another contingent entered through the southeastern edge of the Hirsch, between Akka Hospital and Abu Hassan Salameh Street. Apart from co-planning the operation and introducing the special forces into the area, the IDF provided several kinds of backup. They controlled the perimeters and prevented escape through light shelling and sniping, as well as by blocking the main exits. They also used flares to light up the narrow alleys at night. From Rosemary Saya, how the Sabra Shatila massacre was buried with the victims. Al-Majdal no. 9. 5. One prominent coalition of NGOs, United for Peace and Justice, has been active in opposing the U.S. war on terror. However, this NGOization has impacted the way they address Palestine. The following letter from the Free Palestine Alliance to UFPJ serves as an example of how NGOization can affect solidarity movements. The purpose is not to so much to scapegoat UPFJ, which continues to struggle with these issues and hear the critiques of FPA, but to provide a case study that can be instructive for all those involved in doing global solidarity work. In addition, as Bazian notes, this issue is endemic to most if not all U.S. NGOs. UFPJ, the absence of moral character as we join people around the world in mobilizing against the unspeakable atrocities being committed by the Israeli military in Lebanon and Palestine. We are forced to turn our attention to attempts by forces within the U.S. justice movement who have made a habit of condemning the popular resistance of the Arab people. We feel that this is important due to the continued and unabated attempts to marginalize the voice of those at the receiving end of war. On July 18, 2006, during